What happens when your no-code app doesn't scale? And why doesn't it scale? What's at the root of that? Well, there are three main factors related to scalability that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to go over those first. But make sure you stick around until the end because we're also going to dive into what's at the root cause of any scalability issues you might be facing with your app or that you might face down the road. Now, when we're talking about scalability, what I mean is your app's ability to grow its user base. So for you to be able to add more users to the app and for you to be able to grow your app in terms of features and functionality. So adding on new feature sets and expanding your app in that way. So being able to add more users, add more features and functionality, but still have the app perform well and function how it should. That's what we're talking about with this conversation about scalability, adding more users, adding more features over time, but still having the app perform well. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help business owners and industry experts build custom apps to either start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding. So first, let's talk about those three scalability factors. And then a bit later, we're going to go into the root causes of this. So what I want to do is jump over to our whiteboard here so we can go through this. So if your app isn't specifically built to be scalable, you're going to run into several different problems. You might run into lots of different problems, but they're going to be kind of contained in three main categories. Now, building a scalable app has everything to do with structure and strategy. I want you to remember those two things, structure and strategy, because they're very important to your app right now and for its entire lifetime. So if you don't build that scalable app, there are these three areas you're going to run into problems with. Now, number one is when you start adding new features. Now, remember, we're talking about scalable apps as being apps where you can grow your user base and grow your functionality, grow your feature sets, and still have it perform well. So if you don't have a scalable app, when you go to start adding new features or expanding the app beyond its just bare initial core, you're going to start running into problems. Now, what I want you to do is kind of think of your app like this. Now, right down here in this middle section, we have the very core of your app. And then all of these other rings out here, these are new or just added features. Now, the way in which you want to build your app is by layering in functionality. So you start with the core of your app, and then once you have that in place, you start adding in these new features or this new expanded functionality. Now, when your core, and sometimes this is, your MVP or maybe the first version of your app, when that is not built correctly, once you start layering in these other features, you are going to start to have those performance issues that we kind of touched on a little bit earlier, right? Your app is going to start slowing down. It's going to start giving users a poor experience. It's going to start becoming more and more dysfunctional. The more features you add, the more dysfunctional it becomes. So you really, really have to start down here with this core or this MVP of your app. It has to be built with that structure and strategy mindset. And remember, we're going to go over this more in depth a little bit later. We're going to talk about what's at the root cause of these scalability issues. But I want you to know first off that if you don't build this scalable app, you are going to have problems as you add in more features. So what happens is, in your app's simplest state, in its most slimmed down state, it might be performing okay. But as you start expanding it, you might find that things start to break. Things start to slow down. Things just don't work properly. Now, your first inclination when you experience this might be to think that the platform you're using is the problem. So we see a lot of people think this. When their app isn't performing well as they expand it, they immediately turn to the platform and they think, well, this platform just isn't scalable. But the real problem is that they haven't built their app with that structure and that strategy in mind. And most importantly, they haven't built that core MVP with structure and strategy in mind. So if you don't start there, this is kind of what happens. So let's look at this as if we're inside an XY axis here. So the way you want your app to progress is you start with this core down here, and as you layer in those features, that performance, right, that kind of grows along with it. It grows along with that expanded user base, it grows along with the expanded feature set, and you simply grow and scale the app. But if that core isn't built correctly with that structure and strategy in mind, what we usually find happening is you start on this upward trend and everything seems okay, but when you get to a certain point, you start coming back down, okay? More features you add, the worse the app starts performing, and the less it scales, the less scalability it has, okay? So one of the big problem areas you're gonna see is just around adding features. As you try to grow the app, you're going to have a hard time if it hasn't been built with scale in mind, okay? Now, you're also going to have problems with testing. You are going to experience a lot of testing issues, and this can be really, really frustrating, okay? Looking back at this image over here, when you build this core MVP correctly, or the first version of your app with that structure and strategy in mind, when that's built correctly, as you grow or as you expand upward, your testing stays relatively straightforward. Okay, let me draw this out again so that we have kind of a clean space. Now, just like you want to build your app sort of with this phased approach where you layer in these features, you also want to be able to test with a somewhat phased approach as well. Now, you should really be testing as you go all along the way, but you especially want to be able to test after each main kind of contained development phase of your app. So again, right down here, we have your MVP or your first version, so your version 1. You want to be able to test that as a whole and make sure that everything's functioning before you move forward and you start expanding. And as you expand and you add in strategic new feature sets and new functionality, you want to be able to test that as a whole as well. Now, if your app isn't scalable, what happens is when you start testing, it's really hard to pinpoint issues and, more importantly, identify the right issues. So when you have this core right down here, let me get a different color. When you have this core right down here, you have a relatively contained feature set, right? But once you start adding on more and more, okay, your testing becomes more intertwined. your features become more intertwined. All of your functionality becomes intertwined because you're layering on features. You have the base, that core of your app, and then you layer on more features and they're connected to that base. And then on top of those features, you layer in more and they're connected too. And you kind of create this almost like a web of these features where, you know, you can see that everything is connected. This is my web, so just go with this. You can see that everything is connected. So what happens is when this initial component hasn't been built for scale, when you start testing out here, you're going to be experiencing symptoms of a deeper problem. This is something we see a lot. People having technical issues with their apps that they really can't figure out how to fix because they just can't pinpoint the root cause of that technical issue. So what they do is they kind of they make a quick fix, or they create some sort of a band-aid solution, a workaround to get this technical issue working again. But what happens when you experience all of these symptoms and you put band-aids on them? Well, the root problem is still there. That's still, you know, creating this really unstable structure to your app. The more band-aids you put on, the more you're covering up, but the more unstable it is as a whole. So when you start testing an app that hasn't been built for scale, you're just going to be fixing symptoms because you won't be able to identify the root cause. And if you do identify the root cause, the potentially bad news is usually it requires a significant rebuild because the root cause, not surprisingly, started down here, right? So you really have to start with that scalability in mind, because if you don't, then later on, you're going to be going through workaround after workaround after band-aid solution, after, you know, one hack after another to try to get the app working, when really you're just putting, you know, you're just kind of covering things up for a while, and it's just creating this unstable app. So you have to build with this scalability in mind right from the start. Now, the third factor that I want to talk about when it comes to the scalability is the overall performance. Now, we've already talked about this. This is kind of the biggest factor that you're thinking about when you talk about scalability. You want the app to perform well. You want it to be fast. You want it to give users a good experience. You don't want it to feel disjointed or dysfunctional. But if your app hasn't been built with that structure and that strategy that lead to that scalability, if it hasn't been built with that in mind, you are going to have slow speeds. Okay, that's just going to come along with it. You're going to have that poor user experience, okay, because of the slow speeds. It's hard to enjoy using an app that just takes forever to use, right? It's not convenient. It's not very usable. And overall, the app will often feel broken. Okay, so when it comes to performance, if it's not built with that scalability in mind, you're gonna have slow speeds, which is gonna lead to a poor user experience. And oftentimes the app will just feel broken. And this one right here leads directly back to this testing factor that we just talked about, those testing issues that you're going to experience. The app will feel broken because it sort of is, right? You might have lots of band-aid solutions, but at its core, it's not really working how it should be. Okay, so these are the three big areas that you're going to have problems with if your app is not scalable, if it hasn't been built for scale. So if you already have started building your app, or if you've built your entire app, and you're experiencing these types of issues, you're having trouble adding features, you're having trouble testing or pinpointing issues, or you're just having trouble with performance, know that this is the problem. It hasn't been built to correctly scale. So with that, we're going to talk about what goes into creating a scalable app. What's at the root of these problems and how can you avoid them? Okay, so there are really 4 specific steps that you want to go through in order to create a scalable app. And first, we're going to talk about creating that core of your app, right? That core first version or your minimum viable product. And it's because this is really where everything starts. If the first version of your app is built for scale, if it is built with scalability in mind, then you're going to have a much easier time avoiding these features. So these 4 steps that I want to talk about are specifically geared towards that first version of your app. So keep that in mind. Now, the first thing that you have to think about, and this is a little bit outside of the technical components, but you want to think about the framework of your first version of that minimum viable product. And what I mean by that is which features do you build and when? So out of the full app idea that you have, that full scope idea that has all the different features, all the different functionality, potentially all the different user types, out of all of that, what should you build and when? And this is really, really important, and it's often ignored, which is why it's such a big root cause of these scalability issues, or ignoring it is rather, is that when you don't have the right framework to follow. And let's say, actually, let's go back up to this model right up here. In this model, we're starting down here with this MVP, but let's say you don't have the strategy behind what goes into that, or when you should build each of the things that goes into that. And instead, you just try to build this whole thing, right? This full scope right here. What happens is you start building features that shouldn't come until later. You start building functionality that shouldn't come until later, and you don't have the base in place to support those features and that functionality. So think of it like building a house. Let's say you do a really, really poor job of laying the foundation of a house and it's not very stable, but you decide to build the frame of the house on top of it anyways. Well, down the road at a certain point, that's all going to come falling down. You're going to have really big issues that are going to be hard to fix. You can, put Band-Aid solutions up as you go, right? You can fix the cracks in the wall and so on. But eventually, if you want to fix the root cause or the root problem, you have to replace the foundation, and that's massive, right? So you have to know what to build and when, and that really goes into the framework of your app. Because if you build the wrong things at the wrong time, you're going to have all of this functionality built on top of a base that doesn't support it. And that, again, will lead back, right, to these testing issues. You're going to have a hard time figuring out how to even fix anything. You're going to have really, really big performance issues because it's at this core MVP or first version level that kind of dictates everything that comes next. Okay, so you have to have that framework correct. Now, you also have to have the right foundation. And now we're getting a little bit more into the technical components. So with the framework, we're talking more so about the strategy. With the foundation, now we're heading into that structure that we talked about. So with the foundation, you start looking at things like the structure of your database or the structure of your app as a whole, the page structure. How are you, what's going into the architecture of your app, for example? Single page apps, multi-page apps. How are you structuring your groups? How are you structuring the navigation? How are you structuring the overall app? Again, looking back to our house analogy, when you start building the frame of the house, right? This is on top of the foundation. It's one of the most core components because it holds everything else up. Everything else goes around it, okay? So you have to get those structural components right from a technical standpoint as well. In the beginning, most importantly, with your database structure and the overall structure of the app itself. So we're just framing it out here, okay? Once you have that, you start to look more at the function, so the functionality of the app. We want to make sure that all of the logic of your app, so everything that is making it work, that's making it run, we want to make sure that it's all very clean and very concise. And just because you're not coding, right? Just because you're building this app without coding, it doesn't mean that you can ignore this. There is still a lot of strategy that's going to go into the structure of the logic of your app. You have to build this in the correct way. It can't become too convoluted, and we see this a lot. If you've already started building your app and you go in and you start looking at the logic behind it, what's making it work, and it's overwhelming and it's hard to even figure out for you as the person who built it, then you may have a scalability problem on your hands, if not already, then potentially down the road. You have to make sure this area is clean and concise and also structured and optimized with scalability and with performance in mind. You have to think ahead about when you're going to be adding new feature sets, what those features are going to entail, and are there new user types coming on board? All of these different components come into play, and how you build your app now affects how it functions later once those things do come into play, okay? And then after that, you have to think about expanding the app. Okay, so you have your framework, you have that strategy, you have the foundation and the function. So now you have that structure with technical components. Well, now you have to think about expanding it. So this is when you really do start to, move toward that scale. You start testing it out. Maybe you start integrating with outside services. You start adding on some more layers of customization. You have to make sure you know how to test this, okay? Because remember, up in this testing issues section, we talked about how you kind of want to be testing your app in layers. Now, you want to be testing your app as you go, but you also want to kind of cumulatively test different phases as well. And if you don't know how to correctly go through this testing process, then you might not be able to pinpoint those root problems that are going to cause all the symptoms down the road. If you don't know how to test for those, then how are you going to know to fix them at all? And if you don't fix them, then once you do get to those later stages, this just takes us back to all those Band-Aid solutions where we really are dealing with a broken core. Okay, so in order to avoid these scalability issues, the problems when you go to add features, the problems with testing, the problems with performance, you have to, number one, focus in on that core of your app and make sure that you take a scalable approach to building it. There are two things that go into that, both the strategy and the structure. And that's with the framework, making sure that you're building the right pieces at the right time in the right order. It goes into that technical structure, the foundation of your app, the frame of it, okay? The functionality of your app, the logic behind it, what's making it work. And then you have to think about expanding it. Are you able to test correctly so that you can prevent those issues down the road, or so that you can go ahead and identify any issues now so that you don't have this compounding effect that that leaves you with this web of a problem down the road, okay? So I hope this is helpful in number one, helping you understand what happens when you don't have a scalable app, okay? So that you can know right off the bat, if you start experiencing these issues, then this is likely the problem. And if that is the problem, and if you are experiencing these issues, then you know which 4 areas you need to go through in order to pinpoint these, or even to potentially rebuild what you have. Don't be so scared of potentially rebuilding. If you're in these initial phases, you haven't launched your app yet, it can be a lot better to rebuild now if you're experiencing these issues versus just trying to power through, because you're just going to be compounding the problem later. And even if you have launched and you're experiencing these issues, well, you want to kind of nip it in the bud, and you want to go back and make sure you have that clean slate and you actually have a scalable app, because you have to have a scalable app in order to grow your app-based business, or in order to use it to help grow your existing business. Okay, so again, I hope that was helpful. Now, if you want to dive in a lot deeper, we have a free training that you can sign up for, and it's going to take you through a lot of these initial really critical steps with your app, piece by piece, step by step. You can head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop and sign up for that free training, and it's going to get you moving forward so much more quickly. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop and you can get started with that right away. So again, I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.